Hi, hello, and welcome to the Mercury Astrology Podcast. My name is Rosalie. I am a professional astrologer, body piercer, and occultist, and I am here today with my co-host.
Yes, my name is Bren. I also use they, them pronouns, and I am a professional astrologer, card reader, and pole dance instructor. And I'm super happy to be here today.
Did not even mention the pronouns, so I'm glad that you said.
Oh, yeah.
Perfect. But
yeah.
We also have a special guest here today.
Drumroll, please.
Hi friends, my name is Claire. I am a astrology enthusiast with a Capricorn rising, so all of my hobbies are a little bit too serious.
Share a little bit about your chart. Give us your full big three.
And your pronouns.
Oh, sorry. She, her. I have a Cancer sun, a Leo moon, and a Capricorn rising, and a Leo Mercury. So I'm very excited to be here today with my friends to talk about the astrology group. I've been coming for couple years now.
Yeah, no, a good chunk of time. So pretty much since I've taken over early on into that, you've been coming along. I'd like to say I was doing it for a good 6 months before you came in and moved out here, but yeah, you've definitely come to the most and been the most one of the most consistent and active members. So yeah, thank you for coming and being a part of this.
I'm very happy to be here. Very, very happy to be part of this. So.
We saw that you took notes. You're ready to talk about today's discussion. So exciting.
Yeah. So if you are new to the Mercury Astrology Podcast, we host the Denver Astrology Group. And in order to make this more accessible to those outside of the Denver area, we have chosen to make a nice little podcast here. And this month's meetup was Astrology Post-Mortem. Mm-hmm. So we went pretty in depth into how astrology can still affect a natal chart after death. This wasn't necessarily about when you will die, but rather the impact of a chart after a death occurs. So things can very often signify death in astrology. So it's really important to go over the fact that, things like Pluto or Saturn are not literally death every single time they manifest in a chart. We are looking for a very complex circumstance and very complex transits to coincide with those complex circumstances so that the astrology surrounding the weird aspects kind of all line up weirdly. It has to synchronize. There's
so many factors. It's a bigger picture thing than just this aspect, you're going to die. It's no, that's not how it works. And we did talk about how, things are archetypal. Some of those signatures can look like physical death, or it could be a personality death. Yes, exactly.
Let me just rewrite who I am as a person. Let me just change my morals because I realize that the way that I was brought up is not the way that I truly align with as a person.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Something you also brought up during the podcast that I really liked was how
the meeting.
Yeah.
This is the podcast.
Sorry. The meeting was about how in ancient astrology, a lot of the things that would signify death nowadays are just, a doctor's visit. At worst, maybe an emergency visit.
So that could be serious
near-death
health event. Yeah, near-death experiences, like a bad car accident, but you survive.
Yeah,
that's the thing. Is because we have the technology and we have some of the knowledge to at least better than back in ancient days, to allow you to survive.
Yeah. So essentially, just even the physical interpretations can't be taken as seriously because of how much technology is advanced.
So even if we were doing literally timing techniques, length of life, going over that with all of these people and going that in depth into this, which we're not, it probably wouldn't signify exactly when they died, Yeah.
So. Well, and the reason why we picked death for this month's meeting is because it's Scorpio season. Yes, and Scorpio is often associated with death, and even the death tarot card itself.
Yeah, so, quite literally in that sense. Literally. But Scorpio is not always about death. There's a lot of keywords that we can,
like transformation. Death is a transformation, I guess, in its own right. So yeah, Scorpio can be more also intensity, depth, focus, passion, determination, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, there's many asides. I have always loved, I heard on the astrology podcast with Chris, they're going over all the signs and they compared Aries and Scorpio. And I'm pretty sure it was Austin because this seems like a very Austin analogy. But he said that Aries is like the flamethrower and Scorpio is like the sniper rifle. Mm-hmm. And that is just stuck in my head for forever. And that is very Scorpio. It's like the spy, the CIA agent, the person that's 10 steps ahead of you, already located and positioned at the perfect place to take you out when you least expect it.
Well, and unlike Aries, they're not going to like go like instinctually like go for it. They're going to have tact and they're going to have a plan. They're going to be like, oh, you've wronged me. Don't worry. Like I'm going to plan that out and don't worry. Yeah.
Some of it is even just seeing the unseen. A lot of my friends, especially who have Scorpio moons, they see the power dynamics under structures. They understand the motivations of other people, the things that most people can't look at for very long without, you know, getting big feelings. 100%. Scorpios have a beautiful ability to see the world for what it is.
They can sit in that uncomfortability very comfortably.
Yeah, which is one of my favorite things about Scorpios.
So a few other things that we talked about, not only was we talked about the tarot cards as well that are associated with Scorpio. So obviously we have the death card and that has similar keywords. So transformation, endings, but also rebirths, things like that, letting go, but also with an ending comes a new beginning oftentimes.
Yeah. Or like when the death card's reversed, it's usually like some sort of stagnancy or some sort of decay because of that stagnancy. It's like you are not moving and there are repercussions because of it. Sometimes it's okay to not move. And we see that in like the Hermit card in Virgo, you know, or in other minor arcana cards. But with death, it's really just like, no, if you're not moving, like you're dying, you're rotting, you're getting flies and maggots on you. But anyway,
and in association with the death card, there's also like the decans that we can go into, the minor arcana that also support that death card. And that's going to be the 5, 6, and 7 of cups, correct? Oh, wait. Yes. So the 5 of cups is the Lord of loss and pleasure. 6 of cups is the familiarity, independence. And 7 of cups is the illusionary success. So yeah, thank you for those notes. That's amazing. And so would you, Rosalie, please also explain for our lovely listeners what the decans, how the decans also relate to these cards?
Let me get into this. For some reason, somebody was like, tarot cards, let's associate them to astrology, right? And they just make sense, all right? So the major arcana associate to all of the signs, all of the planets, including the outer planets or including the the air, fire, and water elements if you want to not include the outer planets. But anyway, the minor arcana cards break down to each decan of the signs. So each sign has about 10 degrees of a flavor or a face of their personality, and those can be expressed in the tarot cards of the minor arcana. And we see that Scorpio gets broken down into the 5, 6, and 7 of cups. So all of the fixed signs get those middle kind of chunk of the cards. The aces are pure elementals. The 2, 3, 4s are cardinal. 5, 6, 7, therefore fixed. Scorpio being fixed water, we get cups. And then the 7, 8, 9, the 8, 9, 10 being the mutable signs of those elements. So in these cards, we just kind of see the different sides of Scorpio that we can get. Like, it's not all edgy and emo and dark and deep. Like, there is some sort of, like in the 6 of Cups, that Lord of Pleasure. Yeah. Well, it's familiarity. It's familiarity and independence, that axis, and having both of those and being able to embody both of those if you have middling decan Scorpio placements is, I don't know, trying to humble myself here with my Mars there, but like it's a sense of finding that comfortability in the uncomfortability that you were talking about, that you valued in your Scorpio moon friends. Like it's that sense to be able to do that all the time. For me, it's in my 10th house, so it expresses a lot of like, I overwork myself and I'm okay with that overworking. Like, I thrive in it. I like feel better about myself when I'm able to accomplish things and like go above and beyond. And I feel like lesser of myself when I just do what is expected of me, you know? Which has its ups and downs, obviously, as every tarot card and every placement does. So yeah, that's just kind of how the minor arcana associate with the decans of the astrological zodiac signs.
Before we dive deeper into this discussion, we just want to give some disclaimers and give some trigger warnings. We are going to be talking about some sensitive topics today. Obviously, death is tragic and sensitive, and we want to be sensitive and mindful about that. Some of the sensitive topics that we're going to be talking about include mass death, substance abuse, mental illness, eating disorders, tragedies, and so on and so forth. So some requests that people also had within the meetup was like, oh, like, can we know when you die or things like that? Like that is also not what we're covering today. We're not going to be talking about like how you can predict your own death, things like that.
Yeah. So we'll focus on our first example, which I think really highlights our like role of what we wanted this meetup to be about, which is like the impact of what can happen after an event and after a chart has already accumulated, done, said its thing, it's done and over with. So our first example was the World Trade Center. If you are unfamiliar and are unaware, there was a terrorist attack on the two twin towers on September 11th, 2001 that was very highly, highly, highly televised and highly documented and highly watched the entire time it happened. And because of that, we have very accurate timings to both exact attacks. So the first one happened at 8:46:40 a.m. and the second one happened at 9:03 and 11 seconds a.m. So they're like to the second down and gritty to where they are. The North Tower was hit first and then the South Tower was hit second. We chose to focus on that first original chart to really focus on the impact of the event itself as like a whole, that being that kind of like culmination point. But it is really important to also point out that there are several charts to look at and go over. One of them being like I chose the ceremonial like dedication of the buildings to the World Trade Center as they were being built as a like birth chart of these two towers specifically. And that gave us a chart of April 4th, 1976 in Manhattan, New York. I chose
1973.
Oh yeah, 1973. Sorry. Thank you. Thank you. See, this is why it's important for you to exist in this space with me.
Well, yeah, we're also Mercury pre-retrograde shadow.
Wait, yeah, we are in the shadow.
Yeah, so
and it's in Sagittarius too, so it's probably not the best election to be recording this, but we're doing with life what we got to do. Yeah, you can't let Mercury retrograde stop you from living life.
Yeah, you won't do a lot.
Yeah, exactly. You literally, it's a third of the year. It's literally 6 months if you count the shadow periods. It's half of the year. But anyway, the event itself and the birth chart of the towers just had this really nice Venus, Aries, Sun, Chiron conjunction. They're all okay. So in Aries at 16 degrees, we've got Chiron 1640, and then the Sun's at 1452. And then Venus is at 1334, just out of its own face. Rip. If only it was in that last second. But anyway, Venus is definitely combust and not Kazimid. So it's not in the center of the storm. It's not in that sweet spot. It's fucked, essentially. It's melting. And in Aries, it's also not in that last decan, so it can't save itself, quite literally. And then Chiron is there, so it's like, yeah, that wound. That quite literal wound. And that's how I would interpret seeing that in a natal chart.
Sure.
In general. I'd be like, just ouch. And like a lot of pain, I guess. But we'll see in the first tower attack, actually, that occurred on 9/11 in 2001 at 8:46 a.m. and 40 seconds, that the Venus in the chart is in Leo, another fire sign, in the chart's 11th house, which I really think stands to the longevity of the importance of this event
in communities
across the United States.
Well, and not only impacting the US, but globally.
Yeah, 100%. Because the event, if after it happened, not only occurred in America and freaked the fuck out of Americans, but now there's discrimination happening right and left. For invalid and unjustified reasons.
Right.
And unrightful discrimination in a lot of cases, to be honest with you.
Sure. Well, and this also, we were talking about in the meeting, how it literally, this profoundly changed how airports and things were run. Yeah. So
it also, one of the big things that was important, it's not just airport security, which objectively has been proven to not actually keep us that much safer. I think it's like 90 7% of things go through security without ever being caught. I think it's higher, but I will always lowball my stats.
Sure.
And then one of the other big important pieces is that this is kind of the reason that we were able to pass the Patriot Act, which since 9/11 has been very questioned. There's some very overreaching activities that the Patriot Act has allowed the U.S. government, especially when it comes to surveillance and privacy and things like that. So this was a huge, not just the lives lost, but kind of changed even some of the most basic law in America and has stuck around in big ways.
And that Venus in the chart is directly opposing Uranus in the chart in Aquarius at 21 degrees 50 minutes. So
we're talking about how there's so much air in this chart and how profound that, like, literally this air attack has so much air in its own chart. We were talking about Mercury also right on the ascendant, how, you know, at Libra at 14 degrees, how it was so communicated. This is a highly communicated event and brought people together to
everybody watched it.
Yeah.
Everybody witnessed it. That's one of my earliest memories. I hate to age myself here, but yeah, I remember my mom in the kitchen. She dropped a plate while watching the TV in the living room and like started calling everybody, just freaking out. Just there was this sense of community and just like, let me call my loved ones and let them know that I love them, you know, and like, if I know anybody in New York, like check on them, make sure that they're okay, like see what's happening and like make sure everybody's all right. And like nobody knew what was happening. And it was a really scary event for a lot of people that were obviously a lot more cognitive in their existence than I was at the time. And that impact really shows in this chart and that longevity with that 11th house Venus being opposed to that just disruption with Uranus in Aquarius.
Well, this is over 20 years later that we're still talking about this event too.
1000%. Yeah.
We were talking about like, you know, there's been other terrorist attacks, but this is the one that we continue to return to talk about. And that is still living in the zeitgeist of our time.
Yeah. My grandmother passed away on 9/11 and I have to specify that it was in 2022 or otherwise people will
be like, sorry for your
loss.
Well, I mean, regardless, but
yeah, but it's a little awkward and kind of unfortunate, you know, because it's like right around my birthday, so I always get like super depressed and they're like, why are you so sad? It's your birthday. And I have to like explain to them and it's like this whole huge thing. But anyway, point is,
I blame 9/11.
Yeah. Other things, well, the other air things that we have in this chart that are making such an impact is that Ascendant is at 14 degrees with Mercury right on it, but Saturn's at 14 degrees of Gemini in a superior trine in that 9th house of this chart specifically. And if we look at the Sibley chart too, we can compare that like Uranus is co-present in that Gemini at the same time. And that is all opposing the ascendant of that chart. And it's in Sibley 7th, that Saturn in the moon in 7th. And then also in the Sibley chart, the Pluto would be in the first. So transiting Pluto in the first, opposing Saturn.
Yeah.
At 12 degrees to 14 degrees, that's 2 degrees away. I mean, outer planets, I would probably give them a little bit tighter of an orb, but that's still pretty fucking intense. You know?
Yeah. Pluto being the planet of mass destruction.
Fated events, fated occurrences, things that you just can't control.
I've heard that like if Mars is the weapon? If Mars is the bomb, then Pluto is the atomic bomb. You know, it's like the mass destructive.
Yeah, I could see that. I could see that a lot because a lot of people describe Pluto as a higher octave of Mars. I just describe it as being 2.7 billion miles away from the sun.
I mean, we do have to keep in mind with Pluto and Saturn. So the sun is in a square for Saturn.
Oh yeah, we did really focus on that T-square.
Yeah, as well as the sun is also in a square to the Pluto Chiron. So we have a very major connection between pretty much all of the malefics. We have a sun square Saturn, a sun square Pluto Chiron. We also have the moon opposition Mars and Venus opposite Uranus. Uranus may not be one of the malefics, but it definitely doesn't help here.
Yeah, the moon's also conjunct the north node. So the south node is conjunct Mars, therefore, and then in that opposition, like those are right there because
Yeah, the North Node is conjunct Jupiter and the MC, so that's a big.
Well, they're co-present. They're in the same sign.
Sorry. Yes.
So they're more conjunct by degree, the nodes to Moon and Mars. So Mars is at 1 degree, 27 minutes of Capricorn, and the Moon's at 28 degrees of Gemini, but then the North Node is at 2 degrees of Cancer. So that means the South Node's at 2 degrees of Capricorn. So Mars is the closest to that South Node, but the Moon's pretty fucking close to that North Node and applying towards it. The nodes, surprisingly, are direct, though, which is actually retrograde for the nodes, like metaphorically speaking, because the nodes naturally move direct or naturally move retrograde. So when they are direct, it's weird for them.
Do we know how often the nodes go direct? I don't have that off the top of my mind.
I don't know off the top of my head, but it's pretty frequent. They like dance back and forth pretty frequently. So it's not like too horrible, but they spend most of the time retrograde. And they are always moving backwards towards the zodiac. So they're actually moving with each other right now, as opposed to like approaching each other, which is what the nodes would normally do. So the South Node is actually moving with Mars currently.
Yeah, one of the big things,
in this chart. Sorry.
Yeah, one of the biggest things about this chart is just how many malefics are in not so pretty aspect with each other.
Well, their tethering point to each other is the sun. That visual aspect. Let me see. The methodic, and this is something that somebody asked me too. They were like, how would you tell if this is like a planned death or like a planned thing? And I pointed out that the sun's in the 12th house of your hidden enemies.
Yep.
It's also in Virgo.
It's also in that middle decan of Virgo that's let me understand the gross, disgusting process that needs to be done to accomplish what I need to do, which is what an extremist group would believe. You know?
Meticulous planning.
I relate it to like making silversmithing like rings, but this is obviously a much different metaphor or archetype for that, or archetypal expression, literally.
Yeah, for sure.
But yeah, that sun being the tethering point is also the ruler of the ascendant. So that's this chart's overall happiness and success. That was their intention, that was their desire, that was their, that was their goal, was to cause chaos.
Again, these things are easy to see metaphorically looking back,
and hindsight
is 2020 and 100%. If you had seen this chart and like looked at the chart of the birth chart of the towers for some reason, the transits at this exact moment, and also the US chart superimposed all three together, and had no idea what 9/11 was about, like if you were an alien from another world, had never heard about 9/11 and were exposed to that information and told to assess it, like, I wonder what they would be able to assess and what they wouldn't be able to.
It'd be like, why are we talking about the birth chart of a building?
Yeah, essentially. Why are so many malefics so angry? Well, I mean, Mars is also in, therefore, a trine by sign to that sun as well. And Mars is in its exaltation in Capricorn. Just barely in that first little part, but sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, one of the important pieces that we talked about here as well is predictions. When you see transits like this, and what the ethics are in the astrology community. Rosalie, you did a really good explanation of what the ESAR board believes as far as transit predictions. Would you like to go in a little bit of
it's just here? Essentially like, don't be exact. Be vague. You can say this is the archetype. You can't say like this is the day you will die. Like that's not how you approach things.
There's potentials.
Yeah, there's things that you can talk about, and you can talk about tough topics. You just can't delineate precisely exactly for the future. That is no.
Yeah.
You can say this might be a tough time coming up for you. We can look back at previous patterns to see what the buildup to this could be, what could be causing this, how it could be affecting you now, what differences there are between, whatever's happening now versus what was happening last time this happened, or whatever that may be. If it's a once in a lifetime transit, sometimes it's just let's get our teeth and see, But it's all, I don't know, sometimes it's historical, sometimes it's just unethical to be like, yo, this is the day that you're going to get divorced.
Well, also, if you're reading something like that, like, what is the benefit of having that knowledge anyway?
Well, even
what is the ethics of that?
Well, even with, because that's where you get into it, is like truly, I think the best book ever is Horror Astrology, the karate, I forget what it's called. Oh,
karate?
No, it is it is like a karate book for Horror Astrology by Lee Lehman.
Okay.
I know Lee Lehman is just so amazing with her writing and just the way that she put this into words. She was like, if you're asking a predictive question, you need to ask it once.
Mm-hmm.
And it needs to be keeping you up at night and be something that you literally ask once in your lifetime, you know, because it's that important to you. You are asking divine time and space for a question, you know? If it's like you're on your deathbed and you're like, I just want to go. I just want to know when the next end is for me. Yeah, at that point, I think it's semi-ethical to like sit down with a person and maybe talk about some deeper transits that could be something like that, like a nice, I don't know,
sweet release.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. But the ethics part adds in hard predictions saying we know the date and time of your death.
Soft prediction.
It's never been good for either people to know or for us to, you know, put our money.
Well, let's be honest. If astrology could very accurately and precisely tell you this is the day you will die, don't you think it would be a legitimate practice by now?
Sure. Yeah. Well, it is a legitimate practice, but
a more respected, and like, sure. Accredited, we'll say.
Sure.
Accredited practice.
Agreed.
That was our, mass 9/11 was like our mass death event kind of example, but we also have a few person examples, people, celebrities. And the first person that we covered is Miss Amy Winehouse. She was an amazing musician, singer, and songwriter. And she was well known for her substance abuse, disordered eating, and mental health struggles. And she did die because of alcohol related issues at death. And also she had challenging issues with her male figures in her life. And that still continues to come up today. If you want to talk about the Back to Black.
Yeah. So it was a movie that came out in 2024. It was just kind of like a biographical film, but essentially the film itself was not well respected. It was, a lot of the fans were kind of like upset.
They were disappointed because, first of all, her dad was like, I guess, involved in the making of the film, and a lot of fans have beef with Amy Winehouse's dad because he had pressured her into working more and focusing less on her recovery and health, and he just basically, they say that he is just there for the money, and so this is another money grab that he can take advantage of his daughter, even post-mortem.
But that movie came out recently, and it's a great example of Amy Winehouse, who died in 2011. Her chart still having effect even on her and her legacy, her career, how people know her and what people know about her. So one of the things that we really focused on before we get into like her chart specifically is a diagonal releasing technique. And I'm just gonna too long didn't read you real quick. I am not an expert in this technique by any means, shape, or form. I play around with it at best. All right. I just thought that it was cool and like kind of weird and like interesting to look at. The fact that she was in a level 3 and level 4 loosening of the bonds right when this movie came out and both of her premieres.
Well, and zodiacal releasing, by the way, is a Hellenistic technique, just so people know who don't know what that is.
Yeah. If you want to learn more about it, I highly, highly recommend Chris Brennan's website. I'm pretty sure it's just theastrologyschool.com. 99.9% sure, because he makes it super easy to just access, which is so fucking smart.
And it's also in his book if you're more of a book reader.
Yeah, if you want to read, it's in Hellenistic Astrology, The Study of Fate and Fortune by Chris Brennan, or it is on his website. You can take a whole 8-hour course about it. It's very extensive. There's the Hellenistic astrology course, but there's also one just on zodiacal releasing as well. So if you just wanted to focus on this timing technique as well, it's very, if you want further reading, I highly, highly, highly recommend Vidius Valen's Anthology. My personal translation is the Mark T. Riley translation that Chris has so wonderfully annotated and put in chart example notes for. Which is absolutely phenomenal and has been a lifesaver for understanding a lot of these more difficult concepts.
It's basically like, so this tells you about peak periods of a person's life.
Yeah, essentially.
Well,
we're going to look at from career.
Sure.
So
they're just,
Very brief. Yeah, very brief. But yeah, they're just essentially little areas of life that are divided into important times of your life. So the way that the time is divided is it's an Egyptian system. So it's a 360-day calendar year. And because it's a 360-day calendar year and we have 12 zodiac signs, and it's a diagonal releasing, we're releasing from the zodiac, we're going to take that year divided by 12. And we're going to weirdly get 30-day months. And then we're going to take that and we're going to divide it by 12. And we're going to get 2.5-day weeks. And then we're going to take that and we're going to divide that by 12. And we're going to get 5-hour days, essentially. That's how we can conceptualize it in our modern aspects today is years, months, weeks, days. But it doesn't always time out that way. But each zodiac sign has a different number associated to it. So it's a different length. So those are the basic units. But like, yeah, a year is 360 days, but Saturn is 27 to 30 of those, depending on if we're talking about Aquarius or Capricorn, respectively, you know? So the timing technique is pretty complex, and I didn't want to take too much time with it. So I highly recommend looking out to other resources for further reading. But essentially, loosening the bonds are just periods that represent major transition or turning points in an individual's life. And the fact that she's going on a very minor transition or turning point. So this is a level 3 and a level 4 period that we're talking about. So this is those 2.5-day weeks and that 5-hour day, essentially, that this is breaking down into. This is the change in the way her fan base has really seen her. Like all of the backlash about this movie has shed a more public light on who Amy Winehouse truly was outside of this movie. And like showing that this is like I guess, aspect of her that is a little bit more hidden or a little bit more reserved that we didn't get to see while she was alive. But we'll never know. And that's kind of like where the fans are like, hey, you're kind of disgracing her name if you're just kind of doing this for the money. Like you kind of paint her as a bad addict in this movie. And it's not very...
That too, we have to also consider the time that she was alive, how she was hounded by paparazzi.
Yeah, 1,000%.
She was struggling with mental health and all of these things. And the media was just attacking her and hounding her and not giving her a chance. So I think Post-Mortem, especially, a lot of her fans are very protective over the legacy of Amy Winehouse as well because of how unfairly she was also treated when she was alive.
Yeah, so on a level 3 period from February 29th of 2024 until May 6th of 2024, she was in a loosening of the bonds period in Capricorn. And then at the same time, so when this movie came out, it was April 12th of 2024 to May 17th was the US release. But from April 13th, which is the day after, she was in a level 4 loosening of the bonds period in Cancer. So it was the opposite sign of it. You know, I mean, that happens because when you start a level 3 or when you start a new level 3 period, it's the start of the level 4 period. But the fact that you're happening 2 consecutive, you've got a level 3 starts with Cancer into Capricorn, loosening of the bonds, and then level 4 starts in Capricorn, ends in Cancer, loosening of the bonds. Let's go dissect that axis in her birth chart, shall we? Her moon is there in the 8th house. This is her 8th and 3rd house. And as an 8th houser myself, having your moon there, that is 100% the part of you that takes a lot for you to learn and grow through to have come out of you and to have such a censored and secured lifestyle of like, this is how you're supposed to act. This is how you're supposed to do. You're supposed to make me money, XYZ. However, that childhood would have looked like for her, to more extensive details, was probably really fucking difficult. And her emotions were probably never seen or heard. People with Capricorn moons, like my Scorpio moon friends, are not doing too hot with their debilitated emotional states of being and their emotion or debilitated body, their sense of body.
Which was a huge topic for Amy, who struggled with eating disorders.
Oh, 1,000%. I
and
see
also
that so strongly with that moon. So actually, one of the things that we looked at outside of just her natal chart was the secondary progressions of the time that she was born. Again, one of the topics that I really want to hit on with this presentation was just, hey, there's a lot of different timing techniques and you can gain little bits and pieces of the picture from each of them and kind of accumulate them all together to see how they culminated to exist. And that's how astrology is constantly working all the time. And that's why it's so complex and so difficult to be so precise in your predictions, I guess. But looking at her secondary progressions, we can see that there's a lot of shit going on. One of which is her ascendant has now moved into Cancer at this point, which is what it is, but she's also having her lunar return at this time. So this is, I mean, it happens pretty frequently in secondary progressions to have a lunar return. The moon moves the quickest for secondary progressions. And for those of you who aren't aware, sorry, secondary progressions are when you animate the chart one day for every year of your life after your birth. So it's kind of like you live your entire life in the first 90 days of your existence kind of look at prediction and at timing techniques. So when we look at a lunar return in secondary progressions, it really focuses on that energy of her eating disorder that we see in that Capricorn moon in the 8th house of just struggling with it and going through a really tough time being a celebrity now.
Well, and not only that, like how the drugs that she ingested and the alcohol were also influencing her physical body as well.
1,000%. And it doesn't help that that moon is actually square her secondary progressed Mercury in this chart in Libra at about 6 degrees of the sign.
In the 5th house.
Yep. So it's like she can't even communicate her joys. She doesn't even know what she wants anymore. Isn't one of the last things that she said to her bodyguard pretty impactful?
Yeah. So I'm paraphrasing this, obviously, but one of the last things she had said to her bodyguard, who was, I believe, the last person to see her live, they were watching videos of her sing, and she was like, I can really sing, can't I? Well, I'd give it all up if I could just have a peaceful, normal life or something along those lines, you know?
And that just really goes to show a lot of what she was just in transits, kind of just going through emotionally and mentally, and when you're in that kind of state to not really realize when you drink one too many bottles of liquor that night is not really gonna resonate. Yeah. 100%.
Another big thing we talked about was that 4th house. There's the IC and Mars conjunction. Mars, that malefic that severs.
It's also interesting that her last conversation was to her bodyguard and Mars is sitting there. I think that's a pretty
like a masculine figure.
Yeah, just kind of protecting her and standing over her.
Definitely. And that 4th house of privacy
and her secondary progressed north node has also transitioned and moved back onto her natal ascendant. At 17 degrees, almost exactly 17 degrees, 45 minutes versus her natal ascendant at 17 degrees, 46 minutes. I'd love another seconds of that to see how exactly far apart it is, but that's pretty damn fucking close.
Sure.
So to be having your north node on your ascendant in your secondary progressed chart, that's...
Well, and also how close is this death time to the actual death time?
Oh, secondary progressions, this is why we look at it. It's because it's the day of her death. Are the transits really going to move secondary progression wise if we're animating an entire year already in a day?
Sure.
So if we only take a day out of that year, it's very minimally going to move.
Well, we're talking about in her progress chart, she is having her lunar return as well. That is, we kind of brought that up along with her being part of the 27 club.
Oh, yeah. That's just, because that's just a general transit that we should mention. In all of our examples, they're all kind of like around the same age. So they're all going through the Saturn return. They all have their secondary progressed lunar returns.
Nodal return.
They all have their nodal, they're all near their nodal return or experiencing their nodal return, because that always happens around the start of your Saturn return. I forget what else usually happens around that time of your life. Off the top of my head.
It's a lot of challenging times of like coming to terms with who you are and like, life challenges.
Yeah.
That are hard.
They're difficult. That's why they say your Saturn return's like one of the hardest, because it's paired with a lot of nasty transits in the meantime. And I don't think
especially Amy, who has a night chart.
Yeah. And that Saturn being really malefic in her 6th house of work. And being in Scorpio, so being often misunderstood and misrepresented of who she actually is. But having this deep-seated need to probably love fucking music, probably love singing, probably hated being famous.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, back to the 27 Club, though, was a big part of the conversation. The 27th Club is kind of a conspiracy theory.
Oh, yeah.
A whole set of musicians who died around 27.
They all had white lighters in their pockets, and they all died around 27, around the same. They died within like 2 years of each other or something like that.
Yeah. That was one of the big things we brought up. Is it's not just that the astrology transits are all happening at once. It's that even people who don't believe in astrology have noticed this phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
There's a whole list of people who died around 27. You have a couple of them memorized, don't you, Rosalie?
Oh yeah, it's like, well, Jimi Hendrix and Kurt Cobain are part of the original 97 Club, and then Amy Winehouse has been indicted because they died in like the 90s.
Janis Joplin as
Janis
well.
Joplin, yeah, all in the
That was
90s.
That was way earlier.
Mm-hmm.
It's like in the 70s.
Oh damn.
So Jimi Hendrix as well, or was that? Yeah.
No, I don't remember. I don't know, but the 27 Club, yeah, it's just this phenomenon that happens, and I think it's probably in part due to the fact that these are all celebrities who are in the public eye during the worst years of their fucking lives.
Well, just the most challenging.
That's something that
I shouldn't say worse. That's subjective.
Yeah, that's something that I've loved as I learn astrology, is seeing how human beings are amazing pattern seekers and how many patterns people pick up on. And then as I've learned about astrology, learning how it depends on how much you believe that astrology is a cause or not, but being able to see that a lot of times the patterns that people notice in real life are mirrored in astrology transits as well. So I think that that's really beautiful. If you haven't heard of the 27 Club, highly recommend the Wikipedia page if you want to go down that rabbit hole. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. But that was something that we discussed quite a bit at the astrology meetup.
Thanks for bringing that up. That's wonderful.
Well, that kind of brings up into our next, it's our honorary 27 Club member. He died at 28. But our next example is Heath Ledger. He died in January of 2008, right before The Dark Knight got released, and the whole phenomenon around that movie, around Christian Bale, around Heath Ledger specifically as Batman and the Joker, just really like took off. But he was also filming another movie in the process, in the middle of filming it when this happened. So some things about Heath Ledger, if you will, Bren.
Yeah, well, he had sleep issues. Like, he really suffered from insomnia. That was like a big thing. Obviously, he's like this big actor, and a lot of people described him as like remembering him as someone who complained often about like thinking too much, not being able to sleep. So that actually was what led to his passing of an accidental prescription drug overdose. So this is a little different from Amy. This was actually a prescribed sleeping drug that he was taking, and he was so desperate to get sleep because he would report that he would take 2 Ambien and maybe sleep for an hour, but then be right back up and back into those cycles of thinking and things like that. So sleep was definitely a big struggle for Heath that we're going to talk about in the chart as well.
Yeah. So we first looked at his natal chart, but then we eventually looked at his natal chart with the transits, like just the straight up transits, not secondary progressions, not any timing techniques, just what was happening the day that he died and what was happening at the time that The Dark Knight had its New York release, and then what was happening at the time that his other movie that he was in, I'm not going to be able to pronounce this, but it was called The Imaginarium of Dr.
Parnassus.
Thank you. Close enough. And when he died, he was only a third of the way through filming, so they actually had Johnny Depp, Jude Law, and Colin Farrell finish his role for him, and we'll talk about that in a sec. But that movie released in Paris at a film festival, and we also have the transits of that date as well. So for those of you, I'll put these up in a video actually, so you can look in the YouTube and see what we're talking about. So when we look at the transits of his death date specifically, this is just a noon time. He died sometime in the early morning. I guess his like massage therapist had an appointment with him or something, and when she like tried to go in, she had to get room service to like open the door because she was like concerned, obviously, and they found him dead, accidental overdose. So,
we do want to point out. I think Rosalie kind of mentioned it, but this is unfortunately a rated C for accuracy. Most of our
his birth chart.
His birth chart. Yeah.
Thank you for mentioning that.
One of the reasons why we are not going to focus too heavily on the birth chart itself.
Or at least the housing systems.
System. Most of the other charts that we're bringing up have really, really solid accuracy ratings. That's just something that I wanted to
Yeah, both Amy Winehouse, 9/11 and Mac Miller have AA rated or rotted rated charts. Yeah. So,
but I think it's great to talk about how you would interpret a chart based on accuracy as well.
I mean, the planets in the signs alone and the aspects they make can tell you a shit ton about an event, about a time, it's 75% of astrology. You know, you just can't see the areas of life that it's affecting, so you can't really see how you relate it into like the tangible world, which isn't like the worst thing in the world.
Yeah. So just because a chart isn't, you know, a AA rating doesn't mean you can't do astrology with it. It just means that you might not go as in depth in certain areas.
Yeah, just don't do astrological research with that chart. If you're going to research, get in a AA rated chart.
That being said, Heath Ledger's ascendant really is right in that dab middle of Aries. So it seemed like there was a good chunk of
certainty.
Yeah. So
a good certainty.
We did
kind of guesstimate that he would at least have like an Aries ascendant at the very least. So regardless of where in Aries, we're not quite sure. So yeah, with a 630 rising sign, we can kind of like pretty strongly see that it's at 12 degrees of Aries. And if we add an hour to either side of that, it pretty much stays in Aries. So we can with pretty much certainty say that he's an Aries rising at the very least. So we can at least have his natal housing system be pretty exact.
It did make sense too when we were going through it, that especially with that 12th house emphasis, especially with the sleep issues and that kind of thing, the 12th house Pisces did make sense.
1,000%. And with the releases of these movies, we just used a noon time. I think the France one is actually 2 p.m. because nope, it's actually noon France time. I did do that correctly. I just use noon because that's what I usually normally do. So just ignore the angles on both of those movie release times. But if we focus on just his death date specifically in the transits that he was experiencing at the date of his death and at the time of his death, like he had a pretty packed schedule. He was not. He was filming a whole movie. Like he ended The Dark Knight and said that it was one of the most like stressful and where his insomnia was the worst in his life, like roles, but he still had like another movie that he was working on that he needed to finish up.
Well, we were talking about his softness too with those Cancer placements in the 4th house, the Jupiter and Moon and the IC, obviously, and how a lot of his other roles that he had played were softer and more like the 10 things I hate about you. He's
my
like
favorite movie.
It's so good. He's like
my husband as that for Halloween this year. So
gosh, that's amazing.
Yeah, and he's a method actor, so he like dove into a sociopath role,
especially with like struggling with sleep, like how like you know, getting mixed up with the truth and like your work and then your lack of sleep.
It's like, you can't sleep at night and you're method acting somebody who like kills people for fun. And you have to get into that mindset. And he was able to so beautifully embody that role. And that's what I think led to a lot of his like fame and a lot of his admiration for that role. Like yes, he had won whatever movie awards for like Brokeback Mountain and 10 Things I Hate About You, but The Dark Knight was a different fucking level. I don't really like Christopher Nolan as a director and I hate the movie industry, but the impact that had culturally in 2008 is just a whole phenomenon in itself. And we could talk about that chart alone all day every day, I feel like.
Another thing that we did mention also in the meetup was how the Dark Knight also corresponded with a shooting in Aurora, Colorado, the show at a theater. There was an attack. So it's just kind of interesting how that death also is playing into the
chart itself. Yeah. So we see in the New York release for The Dark Knight, at least, which kind of is like a starting point or like a birth, a baby, if you will. I would like to know, I always want to know this with movies. I want to know like the first date that you finished editing and like called it done. But I know that between their first release and when it goes into theaters, they're still making edits. So that's not even like a thing that happens. There is no like final release because there's differences between the theatrical releases and DVDs or like streaming versions as well. So it's just like a never ending edit. So it never really does finish. And that's a lot of charts to look at. So I'd rather not. So I just picked the first public release specifically. And we really see that in this chart, There's the North Node transiting through the 11th house for Heath Ledger. And that just really states like eclipses in your 11th, 5th are not easy. You think they would be, but eclipses are always harbingers of change, and you never want to change your hopes, your aspirations, your desires in something, you know? You want to stay your ground. And I think this was like a turning point or awakening of Heath being like, hey, this could be a really big role, but like, I never want to fucking do this again.
Yeah. We also made a note about his Saturn return compared to his in his natal chart as well.
Oh, you said that, yeah, his Saturn return had been the most accurate because he had gone through it twice.
Oh, yeah.
So he has a natal retrograde Saturn, and he had just hit. So during his Saturn return, it's very rare that you have a natal retrograde Saturn, and in your Saturn return, you also get it retrograde over your natal position.
Oh, yeah. So there's like roughness there. So his Saturn had, or transiting Saturn had already hit his Saturn, past it, and then at his time of death, it was retrograding just before.
No, it had just passed.
Oh.
Oh, no, you're right. It is just before. Oh, no.
No, you were right.
Yeah, it's retrograding.
So it had just hit his natal Saturn. And then we were also talking about how Saturn is also the planet of longevity, and it's in his work house. So as this, the movies then were released post-mortem, Saturn was hitting it once again after that retrograde. So by the time the Dark Knight was released, Saturn is again approaching Saturn,
his natal Saturn, but for the third and final time, which really just shows like the longevity of the hard work that he put into it, and really not letting his like hard efforts die in vain.
Well, and if this house system is correct, it would be that Saturn is ruling his 10th house of legacy, career, and Jupiter is right on that MC of what he's known for.
100%.
Yeah, the other thing is if the house system is correct, then it's the 6th house opposing his 12th house placements. So very much about not like this house is very much about the things you need to do every day to keep your body healthy and happy.
Well, I mean, he's natally got that Saturn Venus opposition pretty tightly at 6 degrees and 6 degrees, or sorry, 6 degrees and 8 degrees. So
it's I think it's very interesting that during this Saturn going back over and over and over again in his 6th house, he overdosed on sleep meds, which I don't know that
because he was just overworking himself, honestly. But sorry, what?
I was just saying that's something that we haven't talked about as much, as he did overdose on his sleep meds. So it was that lack of sleep, the method acting, the hard schedule, and him not being able to really rein that in, because Saturn is very much about like learn that lesson.
Yeah, and Saturn, one of Saturn's natural lessons is everybody has to die sometime, and everybody has their limits, and sometimes you reach those limits.
Yeah.
And to have that Saturn return be hitting so strongly, because at the time of the Dark Knight Rises release, the Dark Knight, that was the first one. Yeah. At the time of that release, Mars is also conjunct Saturn in the sky.
Yeah.
So like
two malefics together.
It definitely slows down things for sure, but it can cause some extra disruptiveness in the process, which is never fun. So I think that kind of speaks to the fact that we have like an external like event also that like coincides with this release of another death, another mass shooting that happens at this time.
Yeah.
So the cool thing about the movie that he died in the middle of filming, which is Dr.
Parnassus, I think.
We're just going to call it the Imaginarium, all right? Because it's the Imaginarium of this doctor. And I guess the plot of this movie is he like travels through these dream worlds. So what they did in order to like keep the legacy of what Heath had like started filming and still finish the movie and finish the storyline and keep, because he's the main character, is they just transformed his psyche. So when he moved into these dream worlds, he would change physical bodies as well. And they would just use Johnny Depp, Jude Law, and Colin Farrell. And that is how they finished this movie. And that was something that the director was like very outspoken about. He was like, no, I want to finish this movie with what Heath had filmed and what we have, because it's good and it's good content and it's a good chunk of what we already have. And we want to be on time. And they ended up releasing this at a French film festival on May 22nd of 2009. So this is a full almost year after Heath has passed. Actually more than a full year because he died in January of 2008. But notable things about the chart of this release is the fact that we have not only the North Node in Aquarius still, showing that like kind of communal impact that it has on Heath's chart of just his community showing up for him, of his community being there to help support his legacy in a lot of ways. To get such big names like Jude Law and fucking Johnny Depp, like Colin Farrell. I'm sure he's been in things that I know his face, but I don't recognize his name. That's fine. Well, I recognize his fame or name, but I think I'm thinking of Will Ferrell, obviously.
Oh, so. different person.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
But anyway, he has not only the North Node in the 11th house transiting then, but also Jupiter and Chiron pretty closely to Neptune there. They're all at 26 degrees. So Jupiter is only 10 minutes away from Chiron it's at 7 minutes Jupiter is. So Jupiter's at 7 minutes, 26 degrees. Chiron's at 11 minutes, 26 degrees. And then Neptune's at 27 minutes, 26 degrees. So they're within 10 minutes of each other, or within 20 minutes of each other, all of them. So from Jupiter to Neptune, pretty fucking stacked in the 11th house. So just this kind of like weird accumulation of support.
Well, and also we talked a little bit about that Saturn conjunct the North Node in the 6th house too. Well, like nearing it anyway, for again, re-emphasizing that Saturn return element and destiny point.
Yeah, because like Saturn's done transiting over his natal Saturn now. This is now hitting his North Node. This is kind of like truly the last thing that he will be known for and the last work that that director put his heart and soul into. And it wasn't like the most famous movie ever, but you know, that crew who worked on it probably that changed their life working on that movie.
Well, and they had to be very creative on how they could finish it.
No, 1,000%.
With respecting his legacy as well.
And the fact that they even did that to begin with and didn't just scrap it and start over is insane to think about, you know? But anyway, for sake of time, we're going to wrap it up here. Quick shout out to Malcolm Miller or Malcolm McCormick, who tragically died at 26 and is just short of being a part of our 27 club because he fell just short. We are unfortunately too short for time and cannot get into his chart. But if you need any information about the passing of Mac Miller, hit me up on social media, and you can find me at Astro Rosalie, ASTROROSALIE, either on Instagram, on TikTok, or that is also my website URL as well. So just www.astrorosalie.com.
And we'll link that in the show notes as well. And yeah, I've been Bren. You can find me on Instagram as well at Bren Biggs. And I do astrology bookings and card readings as well. And I do a lot of fun events. So if you are in Denver, definitely check out my linktree/Bren Biggs for some fun events.
And again, I'm Claire. I'm hoping that I'll be able to come in and out to help support Rosalie and Bren. But it's been great chatting with you.
You
guys.
Take good notes.
Thank you so much for being here.
So many notes.
And additionally, one last note, we also would love if you could follow us on Instagram at MercAstropod. We post some cool like infographics about the astrology going on and even like pick a card readings, lots of different stuff to give you resources. And also we want to interact with you too. So if you have a comment, you can comment here and add to the discussion or give us suggestions on what you would like to hear next or ask questions, anything like that. You can do that either here or on our Instagram.
100%. So just because we do this podcast after the Denver Astrology Group meetup, if there's a certain topic that you want us to go more in depth on or do like a mini podcast for, I'm sure Ben will hang out with me more frequently.
Yeah. And Claire.
If you're free, let's get you out of the house.
Yeah, I work from home and getting me out of the house is the best thing for me.
We got you.
Well, thank you both for being here because you're at my house today. And thank you all for listening to us talk about our hyperfixation on astrology.
Yes.